Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for Survivor season that I've done a retrospective of, and here I'll be doing my player ranking for Survivor Pearl Islands. So obviously I'll be ranking every player from this season based on how I feel like they played on this season. With that, let's jump right into it. At number 16, the worst player in my mind from Survivor Pearl Islands ends up being Nicole. First boo of the season, which obviously isn't that big of a surprise, but Nicole's this interesting case where she's a player that did seem to be well enough positioned right away, where it did seem like she at least wasn't on the bottom, where Skinny Ryan and Lil were the initial targets, though she ended up making a target of herself by deciding to target Tawana simply because she just didn't like Tawana, which is obviously very poor play there when Tawana has a lot of allies. Again, Tawana was close to the likes of Savage and Rhino and Austin, and they had the majority of the numbers, and through that, it really just made Nicole such an easy target to take out instead, with her causing chaos within the camp. And I feel like the fact that Morgan, a tribe that is so focused on wanting to win challenges, ends up voting out Nicole instead of a Skinny Ryan, I think is pretty damning for Nicole as a player as well. So again, I just feel like Nicole just all around played a pretty bad game here. She's here at number 16. Now number 15. Who would have guessed? It's the next boot. It's Skinny Ryan, who again was pretty much on the bottom from the very beginning. I mean, I think even then there's probably an argument to be made that he should be worse than Nicole, and the fact that he was probably going to be the first boot had it not been for Nicole blowing up her own game. But again, Skinny Ryan at least had a close ally in Lil. I mean, at least that's something. But really, he just seemed to be completely disregarded by the rest of the tribe. I mean, to see Savage and Rhino just talk so dismissively of him is pretty damning towards his game and how little of a chance he really had here. Though at the same time, I think it is also a situation of him just being on a tribe that didn't favor him. I think he really was of a tribe of people that were just not really like him. And I think that's something to factor in here in terms of how he would do on any given season. But again, on this season, he still plays pretty poorly, of him attaching himself to the only other person on the bottom and Lil, and them seeming to isolate themselves from the very beginning. And really, I don't think Skinny Ryan had any longevity in this game. Though I will say he was pretty close to coming back for the Outcast twist. And if he had done so, he probably would have had a decent run in him, and the fact that he probably would just flipped on the Morgans like Lil did, and who knows how he navigates through the game. But again, still not much to really praise here, so he's here number 15. Now number 14. This is where the list gets kind of weird, as obviously we have the Outcast twist involved, where the third and fourth boots make it pretty far into the game, though here we are skipping over them and going to the next boot on the board, and that is Michelle. And again, Michelle isn't entirely bad. She at least does survive the Burton round, so at least that's something. But again, she kind of just attached herself to Burton, and once Burton got taken out, she was just the easy next target. Now, the show really tries to hype up how bad of a mistake she made and not going through with the plan to pretend like she was bad at the gross food eating comp, though really I don't think that played any factor in her actually being voted out. I mean, while the likes of Johnny Fairplay talked about how annoyed he was, like realistically she was already on the bottom by that point and was going home anyway. More so, it's idiotic in the sense that obviously led to them having less of a chance of winning the eventual challenge, though really her entire gameplay is more so just based around the concept of her just being too attached to Burton, who was a sinking ship. But even in her brute round, there was this way for her to survive where it did seem like Rupert in particular did want to keep her around. So at least there was a chance of her staying, but again, still overall a pretty bad game, one that is largely just her picking the wrong side. And once that happens, she's pretty dead in the water, because that for me, she's here number 14. Now number 13, we're finally breaking the boot order, and here we do have Sean. Now Sean is a very interesting player to assess here, as his game stands, I could definitely see the argument for him being a lot higher, as realistically Sean got kind of screwed by the Outcast twist. If the Outcast twist doesn't happen, he makes the merge, and he more than likely flips against the Morgans, to where the Morgans end up running the day, and he probably gets booted at 6. So like technically he did have a lot of longevity in the game. The problem is that he had no win equity, where even if he does flip in that situation, which he more than likely was going to do, he's still on the bottom of the Morgans, to where yeah, you could say okay, he could flip back and forth, but I feel like the Morgans were a lot more solidified of a group than the Drakes, to where I don't think they break apart in the way the Drakes did. And even before that, his game is extremely sloppy. Now, he does have a final 2 with John that does seem to save him early on, though even then he gets like this massive dodo edit where he votes out Burton and then tries to pretend like he was all in on getting rid of Burton the entire time. And really, he was a dead man walking in the Trish vote until Trish kind of messed it up for herself. And even then is proceeded to be voted out over John in a position where Rupert was extremely pissed at John. So I do feel like, again, it is largely bad. And I just feel like there was no actual win equity for Sean because I decided to land him here at number 13. Now, number 12, moving on to a player that I always looked at this person as someone that was one of the better pre-merge boot players in the history of the show, though I do think she makes such a blatant mistake in her boot round here, more so than I remember, and that person is Trish, who her entire move to flip against Rupert was just so sloppy here, where while it is something that I do think is impressive in the sense that it does show that Trish has this game ability to know when to make a move when she has to, and the fact that she executes this move by trying to rope in Sandra, who is very clearly working with Rupert to the point where they're constantly pointed out as a trio, is kind of ridiculous. And also Sean ends up being a wonky number, though to fair that I can kind of excuse the fact that John and Sean had a final two, so it made it more likely that Sean was going to side with them. But still, Trish's actual boot round is pretty sloppy play there, though before that she actually plays pretty well. Again, she has this final two of Johnny Fairplay that at that point in the game Johnny Fairplay did seem to be pretty loyal to, and again she was part of the plan to flip against Burton, held the numbers to take out Michelle. Like, she seemed to be pretty solidly positioned early on, and had she made the merge, I do think she would have been a power player alongside John and flipping back and forth between the sides, though I do feel like her actual boot round does have some really sloppy play, which is why she's here number 12. Now number 11, and this is kind of funny this person's this high, considering obviously this is someone that is really condemned on the show for quitting the game and gets a massive dodo edit along the way, but at number 11 I do have Austin. And straight up, Austin obviously is not a good player. I mean, obviously he was never winning the game, he wanted to quit the game constantly, and again, even if he got to the end, I don't think he would have won a jury vote. Though Austin was still someone that was within the majority alliance on the original Morgan tribe. Again, he was part of the core of him, Rhino, Savage, and Tawana, with him having really good relationships with all four of them, to the point where they really fight to keep him around during the Skinny Ryan vote, though to be fair, obviously his physical strength also plays a factor in that. But also his quit ends up being one that's largely premeditated by the Outcast twist, where if it wasn't for the Outcast twist where the Morgan tribe was forced to vote out someone else, he probably doesn't quit. And through that, he probably would have been alongside Morgan at the merge where they get the numbers after Sean flips, and Austin probably makes it pretty deep into the game. Now again, I don't think he's winning no matter what, but he definitely did have longevity in the game had the game played its natural course. Now really, again, I don't think he's a good player. I mean, he did come off as pretty demeaning to people at points. I mean, literally starts the game by telling the women to flash their breasts to get stuff at the village, and that's pretty dickish of him. But even beyond that, he is someone that, despite the fact that I do agree with his decision to quit, considering the situation he was in, it's also a situation that he put himself in by selling all of his clothes at the village for no reason, considering they actually had extra money by the time they left, and all that's really stupid as well. Like, Austin's a pretty bad player. I don't think he has a good strategic mind. I don't think he is really that great socially outside of these people that he clicked with right away. But the fact that he did have longevity on this season, had he not quit, is what leaves him relatively high based on what you would think he would be at number 11 here. Now number 10, and the top 10 here are all people that did make the merge. However, the question here is the order, and I will say this is probably one of the most difficult lists to put together just due to how wonky this entire merge phase of the game is, with obviously the Outcast twist greatly factoring into things. Though at number 10, I'm surprisingly gonna go with Burton, which was definitely not my plan coming into this video. I mean, I'm someone that I've always looked at Burton as a pretty solid player after he returns from the Outcast, with him essentially running the game alongside John. And while I do still agree with that, I also don't necessarily agree with the decisions that they make, particularly from Burton's point of view, where while siding with the Drake is obviously a correct decision, and him building up these other numbers in Lil and John is what he should do, I do think him flipping against Rupert felt like a move that he made a bit too early. I do think flipping against that trio is definitely very important, but I do think taking out Rupert in particular is a misguided notion. It's one that leaves him as the most obvious big threat left in the game, in a position where he was very close to just being the next boot had it not been for John saving him at the last second, and was even then in consideration to be booted at final 6 until he's eventually booted at final 5. And a lot of that also comes down to his own mistakes. He gets too cocky in the game. He makes it too apparent that him and John are a solid final 2. He also just turns down Lil's offer for a final 2 deal. He really makes a lot of dumb mistakes along the way that do make it very tough to think of him that highly as a player after my rewatch, especially the fact that, again, he was booted out the first opportunity in a position where he threw the challenge, and that led to his vote off. Now, again, I do think there is good strategic thinking within him. Again, I do think he thinks of the game in a strategic lens and had this forward-thinking way of thinking about the game, but I do think he just makes a lot of simple mistakes, and the fact that he's also booted at the first opportunity only for him to then come back and then make some incorrect decisions in my mind, again, it's not that great of a game when you really think about it, and because of that, for me, he's here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that I just find super tough to rank, because this is a player that, while her edit was pretty strong, I do feel like her overall game was not one leading to a win, and that person is Krista. And again, Krista is a strange one here in the fact that obviously she is working alongside Rupert and Sandra for most of the game. And they are in a pretty big power position for a lot of the game, completely running the original Drake tribe. And then in the post-merge, while they do get very lucky in how things play out, they do still hold the numbers up until the Rupert vote. However, my issue is the fact that, again, like, Krista is not that well liked out there, where we have the Morgans just simply seeming to hate her, which is never really explained on the show. But even beyond that, I mean, the likes of Burton, Michelle, and Sean didn't get along with her, and that's why she was targeted right away on the Drake side of things as well. It's like there's something seems to be off about Krista, the where people didn't like her. And even beyond that, I mean, she kind of wastes the opportunity at the end where they end up saving Burton over T, which I do think was a misstep on her game, especially considering she's booted the following round. And again, she really just had like no real potential in the game after Rupert got voted out, to where I don't think there was any way she was really going to get to the end at that point. Though I will say the one thing that I will praise Krista for is that we do actually see Krista talk about getting rid of Rupert at some point, seeming like she's at least aware of her jury perception and trying to change it. But again, she never really has the opportunity to make use of that. And considering her low win equity, for me, she is here at number 9. Now number 8, and this was also a very tough decision for me, where I feel like this person was either above or below the next massive block of people we're going to be talking about after this. And I decided on below, though I could see the argument for him being above. At number 8, I do have Rupert. And again, Rupert's just a tough player to assess here, in the fact that he did seem to have a decent amount of control in the game. I mean, he seemed to pretty much run the original Drake tribe, to where even at the point where there was this coup against him, he's able to pick up Sean and keep Sandra on his side to vote out Trish. I do think he's mostly making optimal moves throughout the pre-merge in terms of at least his maneuvering through the game. Though again, I think his blatantness and how close he is to the Morgans is definitely a question. But the issue with Rupert is the fact that he really had no path to the end. While he is someone that is very likely to win if he gets to the end, he really just had no path to that point. I mean, obviously in the season that we see play out, he is 8th place. He has his own alliance flip on him at the final 8. Though even beyond that, like Sandra and Krista, we're talking about taking out Rupert down the road as well. And Rupert was again just so blatant of a threat, to where I really just do not see this winning trajectory for him, where no matter what, like keeping with the Drakes, he was always the biggest threat of that group. That group was always going to flip on him. Though also his other option was flipping to the Morgans, but even then he's on the bottom of the Morgans. And while that probably would have been a path that got him further in the game, as I do think someone like a Savage would be actually loyal to Rupert for a while, I do feel like still there's no true path to a win for him, as he would essentially need to win out at the very end, which I don't think Rupert would have been able to do. And again, it is definitely a mixed bag of a game for me. I do feel like there are good aspects of his game in terms of how much control he has for the first like half of the game, and how he is a very active player on this season. To be honest, he's probably more active in Pro Islands than we see him in the rest of his Survivor career, where he does seem to be the main negotiator in terms of, again, flipping over Sean at a point, and him bringing Burton back into his plans, and him swinging Lil over. It's like he seems to be a very active player on this season, but I just don't see a winning trajectory for him. With him being booted relatively early, I still have to leave him here at number 8. Now number 7, and straight up, the next 4 people we're going to be talking about are the remaining Morgans that were left out in the minority after the merge, and these are just very tough players to assess, considering, again, I do think the Morgans largely got screwed over by the Outcast twist. Had it not been for the Outcast twist, Sean would have made the merge, and he would have flipped over to the Morgans, giving Morgans the numbers to which they probably stick together. other. And through that, it makes the ranking of these 4 players very difficult, as for all intents and purposes, they should have been players that had much deeper runs on this season. But at number 7, the person I'm going to put at the bottom of this group is very close to the next person. I think these 2 people are pretty interchangeable, but at number 7, I'm going to go Tawana. Now, Tawana was someone that was definitely better positioned than the next person we'll be talking about. I mean, Tawana was part of the core majority alliance alongside Austin, Rhino, and Savage. And at the moment where there was talk about taking out Tawana is able to flip the votes onto Nicole, and that's pretty good. However, like really the main reason she's not as high as the next person we'll be talking about is because she didn't make it as far. She got booted at Final 7, and even that's due to some wonky circumstances. Tawana is someone that I am just a bit unsure of where exactly she would have landed if the Morgans did come to the merge with numbers, where I'm pretty sure Dara would have been the first boot from the group, but who takes who to Final 2 is an interesting concept to me, where I'm inclined to think Savage and Rhino take each other to the end, which would leave Tawana out, though you never really know. But even then, I don't see Tawana beating any of those 2. I think Tawana is the least likely winner of the core power structure, and considering how relatively early of a boot she is in comparison to the next person we're talking about, I decided to leave her 1 spot lower at number 7 here. Now number 6, moving on to a player that, again, I don't think this person played particularly well. However, they did come very close to the end with a lot of win equity. And at number 6, I do have Dara. And again, I think Dara is a player that was essentially 2 challenges away from winning the game. If she makes the final 2, I think she wins against any of that final 4. You can also say she got screwed over by the jury getting to play in the final 4 immunity challenge, though realistically Johnny Fairplay was ahead of her anyway, so Fairplay would have won anyway. But I think that's something to at least call out here. But like really the rest of her game's like not that great. I mean, again, like the main reason she is this high is because of her being deep in the game with win equity. Outside of that, she's on the bottom of the Morgan power structure for a lot of it, where while she does end up staying over Lil after Lil's voted out, she's more than likely the next to go unless Austin decides to quit, which again, she probably would have been booted at the Austin vote had Austin not wanted to quit in that situation, where again, she was the only person not inside that core power structure. But then coming into the merge, again, she's left out on the numbers, and it's really just working alongside Tawana, to where I did think Tawana was more of the alpha, but despite that, Dara was still being targeted over Tawana. And the only reason Tawana is booted in that final 7 round over Dara is because Dara wins immunity, and Dara ends up essentially winning out for the next few rounds, winning 3 immunities in a row. It gets her to the final 4. Mind you, she probably didn't need immunity at the final 5 or final 6. Technically, though I do think it would have been a situation that would have been worth discussing at that point and taking out Dara, considering how good she ended up being in challenges by that point. So it's like, again, I don't think Dara played a particularly good game. I mean, she's someone that was heavily reliant on challenges, or was just straight up on the bottom for a lot of the post-merge, was really on the bottom for her original tribe in the pre-merge, and again, had Morgans came into the merge with numbers, I think she's just the first to go when they got down to their numbers. So I really just don't think Dara played a particularly good game, but again, she got very far with a lot of win equity, and that's something at least, so she's here at number 6. Now number 5, and these 2 are pretty interchangeable to me. Again, I think these are the 2 most screwed over players by the Outcast twist. For at number 5, I am going to go with Andrew Savage. And again, I think Andrew and the next person we'll be talking about are pretty interchangeable, where I think one of the next 2 people we're going to be talking about are the more likely winners had the Outcast twist not happen, as more than likely the Morgans just retained the numbers, and through that, Andrew and the next person we'll be talking about were at the top of the pecking order, having a final 2 to where I think Andrew in particular would have stayed loyal to that and probably would have won if he got to the end, where people did seem to respect Andrew while out there. And while there are moments where his facade kind of cracks and he just shows annoyance at certain people, I do think as a whole, people did seem to like Andrew on the island, where even Lil, before she was voted out, pretty much only had a relationship with Savage out of the other Morgans. And considering Savage also was the leader of the group and also did a lot more of the brokering in terms of the strategic relationships with other people and had a closer relationship with Rupert, it's like I do feel like as a whole, Andrew would have been the most respected person had he gotten to the end, to where again, he is just massively screwed over by the Outcast twist. Now, obviously, he doesn't handle things well when the Outcast twist happens. He doesn't do a good job at maintaining Lil, where while he tries his best to not show how annoyed he is at the return of the Outcast, I mean, you can clearly still tell how it does bother him throughout a lot of it, and he really just ends up failing to flip over any of the numbers that he could have flipped over at the merge. Fails to flip over Burton, fails to keep Lil on board, fails to flip over Rupert, who he had a connection to. So again, he does fail a lot towards the end, but again, I still think that had the Outcast twist not happened, he is a very likely winner of the season, with the Morgans probably just running the rest of the game, and him being the most likely person to win if he gets to the end. And because that, for me, I have Savage here at number 5. Now number 4, and again, this ends up being the highest rated player from the Morgans that end up being in the minority. And that's because I think this person probably had a little bit more options than Savage. And at number 4, I do have Rhino. Now, Rhino is definitely a massive question mark for me in the sense that, obviously, we know that Savage and Rhino had a final 2. And again, you would assume that they would have taken each other to the end, during which I do think Savage would have beaten Rhino. However, I do think Rhino would have beaten the other Morgans. I do think Rhino probably beats Dara, probably beats Tawana. To where my question is Rhino willing to make a move at the end in this situation where Morgans had the numbers to not take Savage to the end and eventually win the game? Again, I think there is the possibility. And I think it's the fact that he does have more options here than Savage that makes me higher on Rhino here, where I do think the likes of Tawana and Dara would have recognized that Savage was a threat and would have been hesitant to go to the end of him in the same way they talk about having to take out Burton and Rupert. So I do think they would have been on board of getting rid of Savage, but I do question if Rhino would have been willing to, though again, like in that position, Rhino then becomes the most likely winner on the board. Now really the rest of his game, again, is really just him playing the beta to Savage, where Savage is more out in front, is the leader of the group, while Rhino is just his second hand man. It doesn't seem like Rhino really does anything too actively, where again we do know that Savage did a lot more of the legwork in terms of building this relationship with Rupert and then building the relationship with Lil, though we do also see Rhino bond with Rupert over fishing, and it just seemed like in general Rhino was a very affable person out there where people liked Rhino, though obviously once Savage left in the real life situation he just becomes an easy target to be taken out the following round, though even then it did seem like he could have been able to put some numbers together where if Rupert didn't win immunity, it did seem like he at least had a path to surviving the vote with his Morgan numbers, then potentially flipping over Burton, Lil, and John, though again not 100% if they would have went through that early, but at least was a possibility there. And I think in general, like Rhino and Savage are extremely close. I think Savage beats Rhino if they get to the end together, though I think there's at least more of a chance of Rhino cutting Savage than there is of Savage cutting Rhino. And with Rhino seemingly being less rigid in the game, I decided to just land Rhino higher here at number 4. Now number 3, and in the top 3 here are the final 3. However, the order here is very janky. However, at number 3, I decided to go with Lil, who was obviously voted out 3rd on the season, and truth be told, that's the main reason she's number 3 here. As I do think if you take that away, I think there's an argument for Lil being number 1 in my mind, where Lil really ends up being the only person that ends up navigating through this post-merge, being in the numbers the entire post-merge phase of the game, a post-merge that was extremely turbulent. However, Lil was always on the up and up on what was going on. Again, she is the one to flip against the Morgans and takes out Savage. She works alongside Burton and John in taking out Rupert. Mind you, I think at that point in the game, she's more so being led by Burton and John, though she's still at least part of the plan, and works alongside them in taking out Tawana and Krista, though eventually does make the move to take out Burton. I mean, a lot of that is prefaced by how poorly Burton played that situation, but she's still the one that actually leads the charge in that vote. Something that I didn't even remember until my latest rewatch, and that I always thought of it as Sandra being the leader of that vote, though in reality, it's really Lil that brings up that vote first, getting the women together and taking out Burton, and follows that up at the final 4, leading the charge to get rid of Dara, and proceeding to win final immunity to where she loses either way, though even then she makes probably the wrong decision in taking Sandra, where she would have had at least more of a chance against Fairplay. But really, I just feel like Lil navigates through this game pretty well. The problem is that I don't know how much of it was intentional. Like, I do think a lot of Lil's gameplay did seem to be based around emotions and seemed to be based around how much other people were securing her in the game, and once people stopped securing her, she flipped on them. I mean, we see her with Burton, where Burton stops promising her a final 2 deal, and at that point she flips on Burton. Dara, same thing, tells her that she doesn't know if she'll take her to the end, to which she eventually flips on her. Like, it feels like that is the MO of Lil, of her essentially staying loyal to you until she feels burned, and then she decides to flip on you, which makes her game very reaction based. Though again, I still think it is impressive the fact that she is in the majority in the entire post-merge. However, again, she just had no win equity. No one really respected her, despite the fact that there was this misconception on the island that she would win a jury vote. No one actually did respect her, even just naturally, but even beyond that, also because she was voted out. Now, I will say that, again, her first vote out, I won't actually look as that bad. I mean, she survives 3 rounds on Morgan before being voted out. Largely gets voted out just due to challenge strength, of them thinking Dara is stronger in challenges than Lil. Like, I don't think she does that much wrong her first time around, but she is still voted out and comes back to the game, which is still a massive knock on her game and does lose her all credibility in the game. But again, I do feel like she still has some decent maneuvering through the game and also had a killer instinct at points, and that's what ends up landing her here at number 3. Now number 2, and these top 2 are very, very tough, as I really feel like my opinions of both these players actually went down on my latest rewatch. However, at number 2, I am going to go with the winner of the season in Sandra. Now, again, I think there is an argument for her being number 1, obviously, as the winner. And I feel like there are aspects of Sandra's game that did go up for me on the rewatch. There's also aspects of her game that went down. Now, Sandra is someone that has been widely reported as being the first boot from Drake had they gone to tribal in the first round of gameplay. And I do tend to still believe that. Again, it is kind of implied on the show as well. So again, that's something I do have to knock against her. But beyond that, I mean, again, she does good work in building this relationship with Rupert and Krista, and them essentially running the Drake tribe from that point forward. Them holding the numbers after Burton throws the challenge, they take out Burton. Sandra's obviously looked at as a swing during the Trish vote and ends up saving Rupert in that round. Again, she is plotting with Krista and talking about when to take out Rupert, which shows some awareness of her game at that point. Though I will say that the actual Rupert boot round is a very bad one in my eyes, where I really don't even get what Sandra was doing during this round, where Rupert himself came into the vote there thinking it might be a 4v4, to which Sandra's vote would have been very important, yet Sandra decides to just throw away her vote onto John because she was angry at John. Now, I think there's an interpretation to say that, okay, she's doing this because she's okay with letting Rupert go home, but she's said numerous times after the fact that's not what happened here. She simply was actually upset at John, and I feel like that's just really poor play. And for her to completely lash out at the rest of the tribe and condemn them for voting out Rupert is also not a great look, along with her spilling all the fish, and her constant attempts to sabotage the tribe isn't great, though really she ends up using it to her benefit, obviously, by pointing at Krista instead. But at the Tawana vote, I do think there is some pretty good play from Sandra. I think this is actually probably some of the most impressive play and some of the best active play we see from Sandra in her entire Survivor career, and her picking up the pieces after the Rupert vote and getting Tawana and Dara to flip against Burton to where they seem to have Burton dead to rights, though she ends up backing out of it, which is disappointing, and her deciding to save Burton at the last second and taking out Tawana, which I do think was a bad move for her. And she does lose Krista the following round because of it, though again in the Burton round, like, she is once again in the majority. She ends up becoming the swing vote somehow for that round, which good on her. But Sandra ends up being a player here that is really just dragged along for a lot of this post-merge phase of the game, with essentially people looking at her as a non-threat because she can't win challenges, and through that deciding to take her pretty far. A notion that ends up being repeated once again in Here's Villains, but that's kind of the reason why she survives over Krista, and why Fairplay and Burton want to take her to 3 is because they look at her as someone that will never win the final challenge. However, obviously something that they didn't seem to account for is the fact that Lil essentially decides to give up her game for Sandra, which, again, don't know how much they even credit Sandra for this, considering supposedly Sandra hated Lil on the island and would constantly call her names, to which Lil even refers to that final tribal. But Lil essentially decides to take Sandra to the end over Fairplay simply because she would have rather had Sandra win the money more because she's a mom. And her final tribal performance is also very lackluster, where she essentially ends up burning Tawana's vote with her constant talk about how Lil was responsible for everyone's vote offs, which didn't seem to be the approach that she should have taken there. And really, as a whole, again, like, I still look at Sandra's win here as a very luck-based one. It's one where there are multiple points in the game where she's out of the loop and things end up benefiting her out of her control. Though at the same time, again, I will credit her for, again, building a strong relationship with Rupert and Krista that allows her to run the original Drake tribe. I'll give her credit for plotting ahead and thinking about the concept of flipping on Rupert at some point down the road. I also give her credit for having a decent amount of win equity, where by the time they get to the final 3, she beats both Fairplay and Lil. Also, even beyond that, probably beating Burton, probably beating Krista. So the only person in that endgame that she probably doesn't beat is Dara. So again, that's something to credit her as well with, though I still feel like as a whole, Sandra is a player that largely gets lucked out at the very end in situations where she didn't even know what was actually happening, and her even being blindsided herself in the fact that Lil votes out John. So it's situations like that for me leave her here number 2. Now number 1, the number 1 player from Pearl Islands does end up being Johnny Fairplay. And really, it's like, again, my opinion of Johnny Fairplay's game went down after this rewatch. I do feel like Fairplay, while there are points where he does hold a lot of control in the game, and he is a very forward-thinking player, and that's something to give him a lot of credit for, I do think there's also a decent amount of points in the game where he plays extremely sloppily and ends up being on the bottom because of that. Now again, he does play very well at the very beginning. He ends up essentially playing both sides of the Drake tribe, initially creating this final 2 with Sean. That ends up being a pretty good number for him early on. He ends up being lumped in with the Burton, Michelle, and Sean side of things, while also his true allegiance being with the Trish, Rupert, Krista, Sandra side of things. While also having a final 2 with Trish that really ends up putting him like right in the middle of the entire game. Now, it did seem like he was one of the main orchestrators of the eventual Burton vote, where it did seem like he was one of the biggest proponents of throwing the challenge to get rid of Burton, which again, I don't think that was in his best interest. I think that was a move that he didn't need to make, especially considering how he really seemed to have all sides on his side. Though he is able to save Sean over Michelle the following round, which is a good play. But then we get to the Trish boot, which is again very sloppy play from Fairplay, where him alongside Trish are trying to flip over Sean and Sandra, and that plan entirely backfires in their faces, and this leads to the who the hell vote for me scene, which is still great. But though again, like this entire plan to take out Rupert just seemed extremely misguided from where they were at anyway, especially considering they probably thought they were getting to emerge pretty soon anyway. So it's like, I guess there was the worry of Rupert flipping over to the Morgan tribe, though really that shows you a pretty big misread on their end of them actually thinking that Rupert would flip on the Drake, considering how much he just constantly talks about how loyal he is to the Drake. But again, John is able to survive against Sean. That's pretty good play there, though at the same time, that's also just kind of due to the fact they all knew that Sean was going to flip if they got to emerge together. But once Burton returns to the game, again, John does very good work in rebuilding his bond with Burton, to where they end up being a solid final 2 and end up being a final 3 with Lil, which puts him in a very good position where he beats both of them at the end. Or again, there's this very anti-outcast sentiment to where really anybody that wasn't an outcast would have beaten an outcast. And through that, John is putting himself in a very good position to potentially win the game, even though that alliance doesn't fully stay true. But either way, they end up taking out Savage and Rhino, which all ends up being good moves on his end. Again, I think the eventual Rupert vote is one that does benefit John a lot more than it does Burton. Again, it makes Burton a much bigger threat in the game to where he ends up being really exposed after that vote, while I feel like Fairplay has a lot more outs at that point. And really getting rid of Rupert obviously just weakens the Krista and Sandra side of things, and really just further allows him to play the middle the following round, where we do see him do good work once again, where again, like Burton was about to go home, yet we see him at the last second do really great work in flipping over Krista and Sandra and getting to keep Burton over Tawana, which also brings us to the entire dead grandma lie, which again, like is probably a bit too overhyped of a move, in that it is obviously this big notable reality TV moment, and one that does have some game ramifications in the fact that now it gives him sympathy from people thinking that his grandmother just died, and also gives him something to swear on, which he constantly swears on moving forward. Though also with the fact that Sandra didn't believe him, it doesn't really gain him too much with someone like a Sandra in particular, though again, it is still a very effective lie to make. Though again, it's still a very forward-thinking move there, a very impressive move for the time. But again, like he remains in control for the Krista vote, only then get blindsided the eventual Burton vote, which again is just sloppy play from the both of them both coming off extremely cocky and making it very apparent that they're a final 2. Now again, I do think Burton does a lot worse work than Fairplay, where I think Fairplay does his best to try to repair things, but still ends up being pretty sloppy play despite that. Though really, he should have been dead man walking coming into the final 4 round, though Fairplay once again does pretty good work in him causing this fight between Dara and Lil that gets them to come after each other, where instead of him being the boot, he ends up instead becoming the swing vote for that vote, having the opportunity to save Dara if he really wanted to, though obviously he does vote out Dara there, getting into a final 3 situation where again he still has a winning scenario against Lil, though again is not able to convince Lil to take him to the end, which is obviously a knock on his game, though it's probably not as big of a knock as you would think, in the fact that again, like I do feel like Lil largely made that decision based on out of the game circumstances. I don't think it was really based on her actually being closer to Sandra over John. I think it was more so just again, she thought John would waste the money while Sandra needed the money for her family, and through that felt felt like Sandra needed the money more, which I don't think is really an indictment on John's overall gameplay. So again, John's game is obviously a very impressive one at points. I mean, he is able to position himself very well through making numerous deals that keep him in the majority during most points in the game. However, again, there are points where he plays himself out of a majority. Him attempting to flip against Rupert and losing his ally in Trish is pretty bad. Him losing Burton leaves him in a vulnerable position as well. But he also didn't have the greatest win equity at the end, where really the only people I think he actually beats at the end are the likes of a Burton and a Lil. Though, to be fair, I guess you can make the argument against Krista as well. But it's still not the greatest win equity in the world, but still a very strong overall game. One that I feel like is still one of the better non-winning games at this point in Survivor, with him maneuvering through the game pretty impressively throughout a lot of the post-merge phase of the game, and him pulling off some moves that were pretty unthinkable at the time, particularly with the dead grandma lie and how he utilizes that to win people over. Again, it's all pretty impressive play, and because of that, for me, he's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that's my ranking of every player from Survivor Pearl Islands. Now, moving forward, I'll be doing a similar thing for All Stars coming up, which is the next retrospective on the list. So stay tuned for that next year. And in general, stay tuned for more Survivor Big Brother videos down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.